Hello and welcome to our webinar. We are going to be talking about faith action for better human, animal and planetary health. My name is Philip Lymbery. I'm the Global Chief Executive of Compassion in World Farming International, the leading international animal welfare environmental organization. And today we have a great lineup of speakers. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our partner organisations in this webinar, the Faith for Earth Coalition based at the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP. Also the Conscious Food Systems Alliance, which has been convened by the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, and also to FaithInvest. Each of our partners will be helping us today to explore how the faith can support a transformation of our food systems for better human, animal and planetary health. We will be hearing from Joyce De Silva, who will be building on her new book, Animal Welfare in World Religion, Teaching and Practice. We come together at a moment of great urgency. As the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said, our global food systems are broken and billions of people are paying the price. This webinar builds on an international conference which Compassion in World Farming hosted in London in May last year. The conference was called Extinction or Regeneration, because that essentially is the choice facing humanity. We are facing growing challenges. 800 million people are going hungry, whilst nearly a third of food is lost or wasted. At the same time, more than 3 billion people cannot afford healthy diets. Factory farming, the grain feeding of confined animals, is the biggest single source of food loss, squandering enough grain every year to sustain 4 billion people. That's half of humanity alive today. It's not only the biggest cause of food loss and waste on the planet, factory farming is also threatening all our futures. It's the biggest cause of animal cruelty on the planet. It's integral to the climate emergency we're now facing. Industrial animal agriculture across the world in animal agriculture is causing more greenhouse gases than all of the world's planes, trains and cars put together. It's by far the major driving force in the decline of nature, the thing on which we all depend. We are all part of the ecosystem, and it's threatening our health. All of these things mean that we have to reboot the food system. We need a transformation for a livable future, and that depends on reconnecting with animal welfare, food production and the environment through more nature-friendly, sustainable, regenerative practices combined with more balanced diets, eating more plants as a global aggregate, and less but better meat, ending factory farming. What this webinar is about is helping to bring together a global movement behind that need for food system transformation. Compassion in World Farming has launched a call for a global agreement on transforming the food systems at the United Nations. Why do we need that? Because our futures depend on it. The other global conventions in existence, the ones in existence on climate, on nature, on desertification, on food security, the one thing we can guarantee, I can guarantee, is that without transforming the food systems, those conventions will fail. So it's super important for all our futures that we change away from industrial agriculture. So why faiths? Well, 80% of the global population follow a faith. Faiths, therefore, can be game changers. The world's major faiths, they own land, they run schools and hospitals, they feed millions of people daily and invest in food-related businesses. They lead and inspire countless people. They are involved in the food system. They have the potential to change it. Of course, many people in faiths are already taking action, and we're going to hear from some of the leaders in that action today. The question really is, how can we inspire yet more change, build this global movement towards the food system transformation that all our futures is depending on? The clock is ticking. So let's get going with this conversation. And I'm delighted, therefore, to welcome you all and to hand over to our chair for the event, FaithInvest's Susie Weldon. Susie, welcome, and thank you so much for taking us forward.
Thank you very much, Philip. So, welcome everyone to what promises to be a fascinating and inspiring webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We've got well over 300 people who've joined us for this webinar, and I'm very much looking forward to a really invigorating conversation. Philip has just outlined so vividly the challenges that we face, how our failing food systems are critical to so many of the crises the world is grappling with. So what role should faith groups play? What are they doing already? How could they do better? What could they do more of? How can they contribute to this such a critical debate as this one? We're going to find out in this webinar. We've got a great lineup of fascinating speakers who are coming at this subject from a variety of different angles and different experiences. Speakers will have up to 7 minutes to introduce their topic. And first we'll hear from 4 speakers, and then there will be an opportunity for questions from you guys, the audience. And then we'll hear from the rest of the speakers, the next 4, and then there will be another opportunity for questions and answers. So because time is very tight, I will introduce the speakers by their name and title only, and their biographical details will be posted in the chat, and they're also on the registration page that you first used to sign up to this webinar. Before we get to the speakers, though, we want to get a flavour of what people are thinking in this virtual room, as it were, and we're going to invite you to answer 3 questions. We're using Slido, which is an online Q&A and polling platform, and you can join it by either scanning the QR code you can see on your screen right now, using your mobile phone. That will take you to the Slido platform where you can ask questions, you can vote in polls, and you can make comments using your phone without needing any additional codes or sign-ins required. Alternatively, you can join on a browser, on a web browser at slido.com, and you can just put in hashtag CIWF24 as the code to get in, and then you can do that on your laptop. Or there's a third way, which is that you can post your questions in the chat. Whichever you prefer, you can include your name, or you can be anonymous, whichever you like. So let's get to the first questions. They are, which religious or ethical value do you think is most important in relation to food and farming? And please just jump in and start inputting your comments, your values. And the first one is compassion. When we did a practice of this, that was the first one we put in as well. So as you see, the bigger the words get, the more that shows that, more people are using those words. So we've got peace as the next biggest one after compassion, kindness, respect, empathy, dignity, respect for living creatures, the golden rule, honesty, justice, veganism, care, stewardship, interconnection, interesting, integrity, love. So I think, because we've got another 2 questions to go, so we'll keep these up. You can keep adding to them, but I think we can see that compassion is the biggest one that's there, followed by kindness, empathy, respect, all of which I suppose are related to compassion, sharing, peace, the golden rule. Fantastic. Ending, minimizing suffering, coexistence, animal liberation. Interesting. Efficacy, responsibility, understanding. Lovely. Fantastic. Shall we move to the next question? So who do you think has the most influence when it comes to mobilizing citizens and consumers in a movement for food system change? And please just look at these and just choose 3. So we have got obviously governments, celebrities, food businesses, investors and banks, faith leaders are in there, scientists and academics, producers and farmers, 0% vote for them so far, family and friends, NGOs, others. So governments are getting a big vote at the moment, followed by food businesses and then investors and banks, interestingly. Quite interesting that we say that producers and farmers have got 0% so far. And I think that's probably a reflection of the fact that, you know, certainly farmers and producers feel they have very little say. They produce the food and then they get a very small percentage of what the ultimate cost of that food is, and it's out of their hands, really. Family and friends, yes, of course they influence us. So the biggest one so far is governments, followed by food businesses, followed by investors and banks. Well, I guess that shows how much finance and I suppose regulation, how big a part it plays in our global food system. Okay, great. Shall we move on to the next question? What ethical dietary choices do you make when it comes to your own food choices? And please just choose as many as apply to you. We got adopting a mostly plant-based diet, buying from local producers, eating high welfare meat or eggs or dairy. Oof! Suddenly the polls are changing. Buying fair trade is in there, eating only vegan foods or vegetarian foods, avoiding food waste is a big one. So far, avoiding food waste is the top, followed by adopting a mostly plant-based diet, and then buying from local producers and eating high welfare meat or eggs or dairy, such as pasture-based, organic or free range. And then quite a number of people who eat only vegan foods and who buy fair trade and eating whatever is offered, quite small, but okay, that's fantastic. I think we will close that and start moving on because we have an awful lot of people to hear from, and they've got really interesting things to say. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our first speaker, Azmaira Alibhai, who's the Faith and Ecosystems Coordinator for UNEP's Faith for Earth programme. Welcome, Azmaira, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you to our fellow co-hosts for having us. As you said, my name is Azmaira Alibhai. I'm the Faith and Ecosystems Coordinator at UNEP's Faith for Earth coalition. Because we are a program of UNEP, I'm going to share with you what our position is. When it comes to speaking about food and food waste, we do take into consideration the following topics. I won't go into depth at this moment, but you're more than welcome to have a look at the website, to write to me if you want to know more about each one of them. So UNEP considers One Health, nutrition, food waste, regenerative and resilience agriculture as some of the key topics that we need to address as an organization. And as I said, you're welcome to have a look at the website to learn more about that. So where are we at the moment? The UN Food Systems Summit stock-taking moment that happened in July 2023 saw countries convene to review progress on the commitments made during the first Food Systems Summit in 2021. Now, its second iteration highlighted the fact that our current food systems perpetuate inequalities and fail to address the rising levels of hunger and malnutrition. To put this into context, as the world population grows to an estimated 8.6 billion by 2030, mainly in developing regions, the global food consumption is expected to increase by only 1.4% over the decade. Meanwhile, the triple planetary crises, and to share what that is, it's the crises of biodiversity loss, of pollution, and of rising carbon emissions, driven by food systems and vice versa, are threatening the foundations upon which we depend. So Philip already contextualized what the triple planetary crisis is, but I'll reiterate. It's the levels of deforestation to rear livestock, to grow feed, the pollution of soil and water, the risk of zoonotic diseases, and antimicrobial resistance are all connected and all require an equally interconnected response. In 2023, UNEP launched a guide. It's called the Rethinking Our Food Systems Guide for Multi-Stakeholder Collaboration. And I do want to emphasize this today, particularly 3 points that I thought are interesting and reflect the engagement of our network thus far. The first is that multi-stakeholder collaboration needs to be broad and it needs to be participatory. There is a value in inclusion. Participation has to be deliberate, and during the inception phase, as we think about solutions to these global crises. Far too often, faith actors have been an afterthought, have been a by-the-way note in the inclusion of collaborative spaces. And this is one thing that the coalition, our Faith for Earth coalition, is trying to change in looking at faith actors as key stakeholders. How do we change this? There has to be a stakeholder mapping, there has to be consultation, and faith actors need to be part of this process, both the mapping and the consultation process that inform the various collaborative spaces. The second is that there is a need to know. So what you should know is where the opportunities lie, what the challenges are, and what the solutions are facing the food system. And this is contextual. So what evidence exists? What are the policy, the technical, and the procedural discussions that are currently happening? Where does the influence of faith actors lie? The third is who and how to collaborate. The alliances, the task forces, and the working groups are plentiful. So where do faith actors make their way or break into these spaces so that the influence that they have are not only recognized but used to the fullest extent? What other ways have faith actors been able to demonstrate this? I urge you to think about that. There are 2 examples that I wanted to share with you. The first is a very, very popular example of the langar. Now, faith communities show up and provide support. They provide aid to all, irrespective of their religious affiliation. And the langar is a great example of this. But here's where there's criticism on both sides. One is that there's little effort to institutionalize this cooperation, that policy makers recognize faith groups far too late, and faith groups are not engaged in core civic and governance spaces. These are trends or notes that we've seen across the network that we engage with. I want to emphasize the importance of promoting good governance and engaging in policy influencing spaces, first at the national level and then at the global level. And this is the year that we put words into action as we explore effective, inclusive, sustainable multilateral actions to tackle climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And that sounds familiar because that's the theme of the 6th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly. That's UNEP's core governing body that's having its meeting at the end of February, early March. There's a need to build partnerships in order to complement capacities. We recognize that there are far too many gaps in financing, gaps in data-driven action, and we cannot do it alone if we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The second example that I want to share with you is of the Faith and Food Coalition. Now, there's a need to show support for interfaith coordination groups to come together to share good practices, to demonstrate leadership through coordination. And when we see a diversity of experiences, that's where we excel as the faith network. I'll reiterate that the end goal is not to make the commitment to the various statements that are coming out, but it's the individual, it's the institutional, community, behavioral, and pro-environmental changes that follow. The Faith for Earth Coalition has demonstrated that it can be a mechanism that facilitates this cooperation and facilitates this partnership. So help us to be broad and participatory, help us to understand the breadth of the networks available, who to collaborate with, how to collaborate with this network. And the question that I leave you with is, what are you willing to do for people, for planet, and our prosperity? And with that, thank you for your attention. Over to you, Susie.
Thank you very much, Azmaira. I was very struck by your comments about 8.6 billion people in the world projected by 2030, and yet overall food consumption is only going to increase by 1.4%. We know that over 3 billion people already don't have enough to eat. So that is a real crisis. And I was also very struck by your comment that faith actors can often be involved and as an afterthought. They're not really involved at some of the core global conversations. So thank you for sharing that information with us. I'm going to introduce Dr. David Clough, who's our next speaker. He's Chair of Theology and Applied Sciences at the University of Aberdeen, and he's also co-founder of Creature Kind. And he's going to be giving us an overview of the Christian challenge to industrial animal agriculture. Thank you, David. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Susie. Thanks to you and for Philip and colleagues in Compassionate World Farming for hosting this event. I'm really glad to have the chance to talk with you all about my work engaging Christianity and animal agriculture. I'm an academic Christian theologian who's focused on the place of animals in Christian theology and ethics for about the last 15 years. And my research has persuaded me that the human use of animals for food is very clearly the urgent priority for action because of the scale and intensity of its impacts on humans, animals, and our shared environment. That's motivated me to found a non-profit organisation called Creature Kind that works to engage Christians with concern for farmed animals and the need for dietary change, and to lead an academic research project on farmed animal welfare in partnership with major UK churches and Compassion in World Farming. In this presentation, I want to outline briefly the strong faith-based reasons Christians have to be concerned about the welfare of animals, and particularly the way we're farming at the moment, and what action should follow from those faith-based reasons for concern. So one quick way into Christian reasons for caring about animals is to think about the Bible. And right at the start of the Bible, the first chapter of the first book in Genesis 1, it's really important, I think, to notice that God declares all kinds of creatures good in themselves without reference to their utility for any other kind of creature. And so right at the outset of the Bible, we have the affirmation that animals are good, that they weren't created merely for human ends, and they're not merely material for humans to use as they wish. And that's echoed throughout the Bible. In Old Testament legal texts, farmed animals are included under legal protections. For example, when the Sabbath legislation is laid out, it's not only human beings that are obliged to take Sabbath rest, but humans are also obliged to give Sabbath rest to their domestic animals, and that they're also not to work on the Sabbath. Later on in the Old Testament, prophets look forward to a time when there'll be peace between all kinds of creatures. In the book of the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah says that when the Messiah comes, there will be peace between creatures and no more killing on God's holy mountain. And in the New Testament, we also find this feature of concern for animals consistently evident. In Jesus' teaching, birds are models for discipleship in the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus says that not a single sparrow, so sparrows were sold in the temple as sacrificial animals, but the humblest and cheapest of them. But Jesus reminds his disciples that not a single sparrow falls apart from God the Father's care and attention. And so there's a really strong affirmation that even the humblest of creatures, God has a concern for them and is active in caring for them. In New Testament epistle literature, the letters, there's visions of what it means for Jesus Christ to be present in the world. And through Christ's death, the beginning of the letters, the Colossians and the Ephesians, picture Christ as making peace between all things in heaven and earth. And in Paul's letter to the Romans, there's a famous passage in Romans 13, looking forward to a time when the whole of creation will be liberated from its bondage to decay. And then in the final book of the Christian Bible, the book of Revelation, there are visions of every creature in creatures of the earth, the sea, and the air, all gathering, thronging round God's throne, praising God, and looking forward to a time when every tear will be wiped away. So in the Christian Bible, we've got ample evidence that animals need to be an object of concern. And in Christian history, that led to a mainstream position that while it might be appropriate to use animals when necessary, it was really important to ensure that animals were never subjected to unnecessary cruelty. And that led Christians in the UK in the early 19th century to be prominent in campaigning for the first legislation against animal cruelty and farmed animal cruelty. And later in the 19th century, Christians were prominent in campaigns against vivisection when major scientific and medical figures of the day like Darwin and Huxley were arguing that scientists ought to be able to do what they want in relation to animals. Christians said, no, if we've got a concern for the weak and the vulnerable, Christians ought to recognize our particular responsibility to be caring for animals. So there's really strong reasons based in Christian scripture and in Christian history for Christians to be strongly concerned and motivated about the well-being of animal creatures. But I think we need to recognize that since the advent of industrialized animal agriculture in the mid-20th century, Christians, like the wider population, have mostly sleepwalked into complicity with radically novel farming methods that prioritize productive efficiency over any adequate concern for the well-being of animals. And that means most Christians are consuming the products of industrialized animal agriculture, which cause such appalling, unnecessary suffering to farmed animals, as well as doing damage to human well-being in terms of food security, which Philip's already referred to, and wider environmental damage. And so I want to make the case among fellow Christians that Christians need to recognize the link between their consumption of animals and their faith, and that Christians have got strong reasons to avoid consuming the products of industrialized animal agriculture and avoiding complicity with the huge animal agriculture industry. And so the non-profit that I talked about right at the beginning, Creature Kind, is working to engage Christians with this as a faith issue. And in my academic research, I'm seeking to publish and build out academic research which demonstrates the clear case for Christians to be actively concerned about this issue and taking steps in their own practice and that of their church communities and among Christian organisations to be challenging the operation of industrialised animal agriculture and contributing to new thinking about food systems and the way that Christians have a particular responsibility and an opportunity to be engaging with changes in practice. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. I think a lot of people probably who engaged in this webinar feel that the world generally has been sleepwalking into complicity with industrialized agricultural systems that prioritize efficiency over compassion and welfare of farm animals. But I think your call to the Christian communities is, as you have just laid out, is particularly powerful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So from one enormous faith group to another, I'm delighted to be able to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Vandana Shiva. She's an activist, she's an academic, a campaigner, a scientist. You probably know her for her work around food sovereignty and genetic engineering, and she's been an absolute giant in this area globally. But she also is going to talk to us about how ancient Indian spiritual wisdom brings compassion into food systems. So thank you, Vandana.
Thank you, and thank you to Compassion in World Farming for bringing us all together. I, of course, have deep spiritual values, but it is in physics that I sought to understand the natural world and did a PhD in quantum theory. I was thrown into agriculture when the area where the Green Revolution was introduced, the state of Punjab, erupted in huge violence. And in the city of Bhopal, a pesticide plant leaked. And I was doing a study for the United Nations University. And I said, some conflict is going on here, and I think it's worth understanding. And I did. So I wrote a book on the violence of the Green Revolution. And since that time, my journey really has been on how do you cultivate a non-violent agriculture, which means a non-violent relationship with the soil and the biodiversity and all beings. A lot of my learning has come from farmers themselves. And the beauty of India is there is no line drawn between this is the material world and this is the sacred. The sacred permeates everything, the universe. And that's why we talk of the world as one family. And what permeates along with divinity is the material conditions of life, because these are not separate. When I started to look, I found Albert Howard's book, which he wrote Learning from Indian Peasants when he was sent to India in 1905. And Howard says, I made the Indian peasants my professors. And the two principles he learned from Indian peasants was you never farm in monocultures, and you never divide up plants and animals. And the second very powerful concept, you never just take and take and take. He called it the law of return. Other scientists like Liebig have called it the law of recycling. For ordinary practicing Indian peasants, it is the law of gratitude. A thank you to Mother Earth. So much of what I know about faith and food and farming is from the practiced spirituality of ordinary Indian peasants. There wouldn't be a farmer in the world today unless they felt the obligation to take care of the earth and to provide food. So when we've had long protests, and right now there are protests all over Europe, but in India we had a 14-month protest. And what the farmer was constantly saying was, growing food is my dharma, taking care of the land is my dharma. And then, of course, as I got deeper into the food issue, I started to read the older texts. And it's quite amazing because everything I have learned in ecology is there in the ancient texts. A particular Upanishad called the Taittiriya Upanishad. It is totally dedicated to food. And it begins by saying everything is something else's food. Food is a cycle. Food is the currency of life. Food is need. Food connects us. Anna connects us. That indeed, all beings are born of food. It is from food that we obtain the necessary sustenance for living. And having lived, it is into food that you merge back. And seeing food in this currency of life means you don't allow it to be degraded. You don't allow it to be reduced to a commodity. You don't allow it to be toxified. And you recognize all the living beings who participate in the food cycle. And you are part of it. You're just food for the microbes who'll eat you when you die. So there's no anthropocentric arrogance. It is an equalizer. Food is an amazing equalizer when seen in the cycle of life. And we participate in that cycle of life. Participating in the cycle of life is not the violence. It's the violence against that cycle, against the biodiversity that makes that cycle. But out of it flows the other values, the other dharmas, including the understanding of ecology, that food actually weaves the web of life. All beings are formed of Anna. Anna arises from the rains, so it's connected to the hydrological cycle. The rains arise from yagna, which means effort, sacrifice, and that arises from karma, the right action. So being human is growing food with care and compassion. And food, of course, is sacred because, in fact, in India, we say Annam Brahma. Food is the creator. Do not look down on food. That is the inviolable discipline for the one who knows. Prana, breath, the winds of life are indeed food. And the body, the sharir, is the partaker of Anna. Sharir is secured in prana and prana is secured in sharira. This cycle of interdependence is what we have to maintain. That's our sacred duty. And most significantly, the whole issue of food justice. Even today, I have seen in villages in India where they ring a bell before eating themselves to ensure that no one is hungry. And any hungry person comes and eats, and only then the family will eat. And this is what the ancient Taittiriya Upanishad says. Do not send away anyone who comes to your door without offering them food and hospitality. This is the inviolable discipline of humankind. Therefore, have a great abundance of food and exert all your efforts towards ensuring such abundance and announce to the world that the abundance of food is ready to be partaken by all. These principles put into practice are the way we grow enough food, not just for human beings, for all beings. We've just had a festival about 5 days ago, celebrating the animals, the Matu Pongal. And the Pongal, along with the, about every part of India with a different name, same festival of gratitude to the earth and celebrating the abundance of food. Justice is a sacred duty. I did a food and faith dialogue, and I just asked every religion to talk about what their sacred texts say about food. Every religion said, feed the hungry. Every religion said, grow food in abundance. So that's what we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Vandana. What an inspiring journey you took us on to go back, as Dr. David did as well, to our ancient texts. What strikes me is that we know what we should be doing. We've known it. Somehow we've lost our way. And I loved your phrase, food weaves the web of life. That really reminds us of all the interconnected relationships we form as part of food producers or food consumers. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, and he will be the last speaker before we have a set of Q&A. So please do feel free to put your questions in now. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Thomas Legrand. He's the lead technical advisor for the Conscious Food Systems Alliance, which is run by UNDP. And he's going to talk about integrating consciousness approaches into food systems initiatives. Thomas, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. Hello, everyone. Great to be part of this important discussion and to follow such deep sharings. So I will present our initiative, the Conscious Food Systems Alliance that UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, is convening. And as our tagline said, we are focusing on inner capacities as a complementary approach to transform food systems. Can go to the next slide. So we have been launched a little bit more than a year ago after 2 years of co-creation with partners. And this is our model of transformation in which we are talking about using consciousness approaches such as mindfulness, nonviolent communication, nature connections, self-reflection, etc. And to apply these, integrate that in our efforts into interventions across the food systems at 3 levels. At the personal level, of course, through trainings, learning journeys, etc. At the group level, that is very important to be able to design spaces for dialogue that are connecting, deep and safe, so that we can have deeper discussions. And finally, at the institutional level, how we can support the cultural transformation of our organizations and specific private and public policies for this agenda. And we think that by doing so, we can support shift in consciousness through the cultivation of what we call inner capacities, which is all from mindsets, values, beliefs, worldview, all the concepts that we are using to describe our inner worlds, and emphasizing changing in connection and relationship with ourselves, with others, and with nature. And we think this can be the inner basis for regenerative food system. And indeed, we are not just participating to Regen 10, a coalition for regenerative agriculture, which is just recognizing mental models as one of the key enablers for regeneration. You can go to the next slide. So we have identified entry point for this agenda throughout the whole food systems, from farms to forks. And we have started to have discussions about these different entry points. So we are having what we call collective inquiries, and they are ongoing still, on farmers' well-being and psychological resilience. We know this is such an important issue. We are having also discussion on how on local communities and cultures for regeneration, including, as I said, in the context of this Regen 10 coalition, for which we will develop a tool for local community to discuss their own cultural values through the lens of regeneration. And we are having also some discussion on traditional wisdom for conscious food systems, building on a dialogue we've had with indigenous people and local communities last year. Can move to the next slide. So here are some of our activities. We have developed and tested a conscious food systems leadership program with our partner, the Inner Green Deal, that will be offering to many of our members in the next years. We have developed a conscious food incubator, and we had a first call for proposal last year, and we are supporting some 4 small interventions to test the integration of these consciousness approaches into food interventions. And 2 events that we'll be having in April, mindfulness food and farming retreat in Plum Village, the monastery of Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh, by which I live. So that will be for our members. And we are convening also a donors roundtable on inner change for a just and regenerative future. So feel free to contact us if you're interested in this. Can go to the next slide. So COFSA is not the Conscious Food Systems Alliance. We call it COFSA. Is not a faith-based initiative, but we do recognize the important role that faith and religious organizations, teachings and practices can have in supporting consciousness development and its role for the transformation of our food and agriculture systems. So building on the works of our members, some of them are faith-based or inspired organizations like Opportunity International and World Vision. And this has been the basis for them to develop some training to like the holistic development training of Opportunity International or the empowered worldview model or world vision in order to support this kind of inner change for sustainability. We have grassroots organizations like CKM in Egypt who are harnessing Islamic teachings to support their efforts in regenerative agriculture. Shumai International, for example, bringing their unique perspective on their work on farming, etc., etc. So, yes, just the next one to conclude. Yeah, so here's our website, consciousfoodsystems.org, my email, and very happy to be part of this conversation. And we hope to be able to support more engagement of faith-based organization in this in our efforts for food systems transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. That was absolutely fascinating. I suppose that food system change actually in the end begins with us all as individuals, and that's where a consciousness approach can be very powerful. But I was really interested to see how you're using these approaches to actually achieve much bigger, wider systemic change. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. So now is the opportunity for you to ask questions of our first 4 speakers. And we'll have about 15, just over 10 minutes, actually, about 13 minutes to do this. So once again, please either go to slido.com on a web browser and type in the code that you can see on the screen, or use your phone to scan the QR code and be taken to the website on your phone. Or alternatively, please feel free to post your questions in the chat function. I'll just give a couple of minutes or so while people post their questions. I mean, I suppose we could start with one question that came in earlier, which is really what can we do as individuals? And I wonder who would like, from our 4 speakers, who would like to take that sort of question first?
I'm happy to start. Yeah, I'm happy to start if you like, Susie. So Creature Kind is working specifically with Christians to be trying to encourage people to be engaging this issue. And we sort of often find people in particular church communities who recognize the importance of thinking about animal welfare and consumption of animals, but often feel like they don't know where to start in terms of organizing and talking to other people. And so one of the things we want to do is mentor individuals to begin to have conversations within their communities about pathways to change. And I mean, one helpful thing is just begin to, within any community, faith-based or otherwise, begin to see if you can find 2 or 3 other sort of like-minded people to begin a conversation, and then strategize together about what kinds of next steps could take that conversation out more widely. And so in the church communities that we work in, sometimes that's a few members getting together over coffee, and then that turns into, okay, well, we could set up a meeting to discuss this, or maybe we could talk to the church leadership about prioritizing this as an issue. And then quite early on, we hope in those conversations, there's questions about practice. So what are we eating when we come together as a faith community to have meals together? Shared meals are a really important component of Christian practice, as in the practice of other faith communities. And so paying attention to what gets put on the table at those meetings and having conversations about what good eating together would look like, I think is another really helpful way in the context that Creature Kind works to take things forward.
I think a lot of faith institutions underestimate the power of their wallets. I remember a few years ago talking to a very large African-American church in the United States who literally spent hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on food at various events. They had never once considered how they sourced that food. Can I just perhaps move on to Vandana as well, with a comment about this, and maybe can you share any sort of examples of best practice in sustainable food systems from other religions? You've spoken very powerfully about what the traditional Indian peasant does in terms of how their spirituality is deeply integrated into how they farm. Can you share any other examples that you're aware of?
Well, I think all indigenous cultures across the entire planet saw the earth as mother, worked according to the laws of the earth as laws to guide your actions, and in the process cultivated good food and diverse food, and lasted for centuries. 60,000 years, the Aboriginal farming system of Australia sustained that continent and made it more beautiful. India, 10,000 years, the Amazonian Indians, 10,000 years. China, similar lengths. And I think this, it's really in Europe that the church was separated from life. And tragically, expertise on living was turned into a witch hunt. 9 million people were killed for knowing how to live well, how to get healing plants to heal yourself. And this separation of the sacred from the everyday and the living, I think is what is still being overcome in the West in a very deep way. Whereas all indigenous culture, before they colonized, and those who managed to the beauty is 85% of the biodiversity today is on 20% of the land, which is still in the hands of indigenous people. And that's why we need to turn to them. And in no culture do they not have reverence for food and reverence for other beings. And the two other principles that I've learned from across the world is real food systems are food systems where all beings participate. Normally we say humans as the producer, but when we realize the web of life is the pollinators, is the soil organisms, then we realize we are partners in a creative process. But the second thing, which is even more important, when we talk about food and hunger, today we only look at the human beings who are hungry. We don't look at the numbers of other species that have been driven to extinction by taking away their habitat and their food. I mean, it was mentioned, I think, the issue of diverting food grain to animal feed for factory farms. It's the creation of an artificial hunger when the earth has enough capacity to create abundance. So we need to think not just of all human beings and their food rights, but we need to think of all beings. And that is where, not faith as an institutionalized system, not faith as institutionalized text, but faith as the living guidance of how to live with other species and other beings by sharing the food and growing the food together. And at every point realizing that because food is sacred, eating is a spiritual act. And that every one of us can frame in our particular way of orienting our spiritual life. But the minute we put spirituality into every act of eating, all the consciousness comes with it. How was it grown? What has it cost? What's it doing to my body? And the taking for granted of food as stuff, that anything can be eaten. We start to realize the violence against the earth, the violence against the farmers, and the violence against our bodies are the same violence. Because we are made of the same things.
Yes, and I suppose another way to put that is that eating is a moral act, because we have to make choices every time we choose what we eat and when we eat and so on. We've had another question that's come in, which actually is very pertinent, I think, to this discussion. So we began with saying, what can we do as individuals? But the question that's come in says, we need to move. How do we move the discussion from personal choice and individual consciousness to one that tackles industrialized agriculture? How do we end subsidies for big ag? How do we shift public procurement practices? And how do we counter the influence that so many of the giant mega corporations involved in our food systems, you know, the influence they have over governments and also over ourselves? Thomas, do you want to just maybe begin by tackling that, and then I'll open it to the other speakers?
Okay, I can say a few words on that, but I was very inspired to hear Vandana, and to me it was a perfect transition with which I have to share, because one of the practice we are promoting in the Conscious Food Systems Alliance is a mindful eating practices, and we have done that, including in conferences where we give some guidance and invite people to contemplate their food and then eat in silence for 20 minutes. And that has been, we have been told that it has been for some people an eye-opening experience. So that's something we'd like to promote and share, that people invite their colleagues, for example, and friends into that kind of experience. But yeah, getting back to your question, I mean, there are many sides to it, from, how do we build movements that are able to challenge the power of, there's a big power problems in food systems, but from our perspective, what we are trying to work on is a kind of narrative, because also power is exerted through the dominant narrative, which leads us to think that industrial agriculture is a solution. So how can we expose the assumptions and show that no, there are other ways to think about the food systems challenges, the hunger, the health problems, etc., than the one that are traditionally put forward. And yes, we are at the moment. I mentioned, the call for proposal we are supporting one of our partners in Colombia, OPEPA, to develop a guide and a training on alternative narratives for food systems transformation, and that will be targeted to communicators, journalists, so that we are aware of the story we are communicating on food systems.
Thank you, Thomas. Alternative narratives, that's what we need, or one of the things we need, says Thomas. What are the other things we can do to counter the influence of big ag in our world? I don't know if either Vandana or David would like to take that up.
Sorry, go on, Vandana. You go ahead.
No, I think part of the work of every conscious being is to listen to others who are in pain. There are lots of people listening to the pain of animals, but there's no one listening to the pain of the farmers. Why are they on the streets everywhere? And, we have to see the policies of the big ag that has already caused the problems of species extinction and climate catastrophe and bad food and ill health and the disappearance of family farm. They're now looking at farming without farmers and food without farms, lab food, and more digitalization and mechanization. Farmers are getting this sense they want us to be redundant. They want to remove us from the land. And I think we have to take that issue seriously, because the issue of caring and compassion requires people who care and have compassion. And the idea that you can always find the next chemical, the next technology, the next big machine to substitute the farmers with energy slaves is a huge tragedy. Also, if you look at it in terms of ecology and entropy, I won't extend that. But energy slaves are the reason we have the climate havoc and atmospheric pollution. We need real people to care for the land, to build local economies, because everyone must eat. And when they eat locally, then the farmers grow what local people eat. When you do global trade, you grow 10 commodities and ship it thousands of miles, creating emissions at every step. You degrade the planet, you degrade your health, you degrade the food, and you make the farmer disappear. And as I said, the nature, the earth, farmers, and eaters have to start seeing themselves as one continuum of maintaining life in its sanctity and its integrity and its diversity. And so we fragmented things too much, and we have allowed, we talked about alternative narratives, we have allowed the dominant narrative to always decide for us how we will think and how we will act. So we just have to have more, not just more compassionate action, we have to have more compassionate thinking of our relationships with everyone else, and get a sense of where are the powerful pushing the system for their next multiplication of profits, where species disappear, biodiversity disappears, farmer disappears, health disappears.
Thank you, Vandana.
So, food to me, I just, I've stepped into the food agriculture issue because of the violence I've witnessed. I'm staying in there because the violence is growing, and we all together can do a lot. And I think even today, the tendency has been, when you think of faith, you bring it down to your particular faith. When we think of faith, we should elevate it to the unifying principles that cut across faiths.
That's very inspiring call to action there. David, we need to move on, but I don't know if you just want to add anything very quickly to this particular conversation about countering big ag.
I do accept the challenge that we can't solve this issue just through individual dietary choice, and that big ag, would like nothing better than that just gets reduced to a consumerist question. But I think thinking about this in a faith-based context should also make us realize that there needs to be an integrity between individual and community practice and political activism. So I'm actually enthusiastic about engaging Christians at grassroots levels with, first of all, conscientization about industrial animal ag, and also the need for dietary change as a way of forming a community that's then capable of a political opposition and challenging the power of the industry and the subsidies that are thrown away on this sort of cruel and destructive activity. So I think we need to think both in relation to sort of individual community and political action, that we don't need to choose between them.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all four of our earlier speakers. Azmaira unfortunately had a problem with her connection, so that's why she didn't join us for this Q&A. And we're going to lose Dr. Vandana Shiva now because it's very late where she is. But thank you very much to all of you for opening this webinar with your contributions. It's been fantastic. And we'll see you, Thomas and David, at the end. So I'm going to move on now to our next speaker, who is Joyce De Silva, who's the Ambassador Emeritus for Compassion and Well Farming. And she's going to talk about, she's going to discuss how the faith, or whether the faith can inspire us in repairing our broken food systems. So, Joyce.
Hello, and welcome everyone. It's been so interesting already. I'm going to talk particularly about what the faiths say about the human relationship with animals. As Philip said at the beginning, 80% of the global population profess a belief in a faith. And all the major faiths teach that animals are God's creatures, that they praise him or her, or perhaps that they are sentient beings like us, who are also subject to samsara, rebirth, and so on. And so I thought I'd just like to share with you some examples from the holy books of the different faiths, And in my own book, obviously, there's a whole lot more. And there's a wonderful story in the Hindu scriptures, the one called the Mahabharata, about King Yudhisthira who's about to enter heaven, but refuses to do so without his faithful dog. And in fact, in the end, he offers for the dog to go to heaven and he will stay on earth. And in another famous Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, the god Krishna teaches Arjuna about the fact that the divine exists in all beings. And what he says is, wise ones see the self-same thing in a Brahmin, wise and courteous, as in a cow or an elephant or a dog or an outcast. It's a bit sad to know that outcasts were still happening at that time. To move on to Buddhism, there's an absolutely beautiful prayer in Buddhism called the Metta or loving kindness prayer. And it says, may all beings everywhere be happy. May they be healthy. May they be at peace. May they be free. And I also have to say that I absolutely love the words of an early Christian saint, Saint Isaac the Syrian, who described a merciful heart as, and I quote, a heart on fire for the whole of creation, for humanity, for the birds, for the animals, and for all that exists. And in the Sikhs' holy book, the Guru Granth Sahib, it says the merit of pilgrimages to the 68 holy places do not equal having compassion for other living beings. And in the Holy Quran, it declares that animals are communities like yourselves, and that Allah cares for his creatures. And one verse says, there's not a creature that moves on earth whose provision is not his concern. He knows where it lives and its final resting place. So there are all these wonderful things and so many more. And yet the well-being of animals seems to be ignored. Globally, over 80 billion animals a year are slaughtered for food. The majority of those reared in industrial factory farms, where they may be kept indoors, very crowded, no opportunities for normal behavior or interaction. They may have their bodies modified by breeding, being bred for fast growth or high milk yield or egg yield. And this often causes them intense suffering and a shortened lifespan, which of course will be shortened by humans anyway. And some animals are subjected to surgical procedures like castration, tail docking, beak trimming, cutting off the tip of the very sensitive beak of hens. And these operations are often done without pain relief. So it's a miserable life. But other animals are used, over 100 million animals a year are used in laboratories, often for fairly useless reasons. Others are used for tourist rides, entertainment, so-called sports like hunting and cockfighting and bullfighting. And sadly, in some Hindu temples, you find that elephants are chained by the leg, except when they're put on show. However, the nice thing to know is that not only is the teaching in the holy books, but lots of other faith people over the years and up to the present day are taking a very different attitude. So, for example, the medieval Jewish scholar Maimonides wrote, "It shouldn't be believed that all the beings exist for the sake of the existence of humanity. On the contrary, all the other beings too have been intended for their own sakes and not for the sake of something else." And this is a big kind of philosophical argument within many faiths, actually. Are animals there for us or for themselves? And there's a contemporary rabbi, David Rosen, who says, "I don't see how anyone familiar with Jewish teaching in relation to animals and with the abhorrent cruelties involved in animal factory farming can justify the latter. For me, it's obvious that Jewish teaching explicitly condemns such conduct." And of course, we'll hear more about that later from Rabbi Neril. There was a very famous 19th century Hindu teacher, Swami Vivekananda, and he expressed the Hindu view very well. He said, in every man and in every animal, however weak or wicked, great or small, resides the same omnipresent, omniscient soul. The difference is not in the soul, but in the manifestation. Between me and the smallest animal, the difference is only in manifestation. But as a principle, he's the same as I am. He's my brother. He has the same soul as I have. And of course, the great Mahatma Gandhi, in his autobiography, he said, to my mind, the life of a lamb is not less precious than that of a human being. I should be unwilling to take the life of a lamb for the sake of the human body. And a very well-known contemporary Buddhist monk, Mathurika, says that the world cannot pretend to uphold decent and coherent moral values and at the same time exclude from the ethical field the majority of the sentient beings who populate the earth. And the contemporary Islamic environmentalist Fazlun Khalid says there's absolutely no evidence in the sacred texts that would in any way support factory farming. The exemplary behavior of the prophet points to care, concern, and compassion. And if you move to Christianity, and I know the church has a lot to answer for over the ages in bad treatment of animals, but Pope John Paul II, who has now been canonized, wrote, human beings may be merciful to their neighbors, but the compassion of the Lord extends to every living creature. And our current Pope Francis issued a radical encyclical, Laudato Si, in 2015, and he calls for an ecological conversion, which, and I quote, entails a loving awareness that we are not disconnected from the rest of creatures, but joined in a splendid universal communion. And so they're just a few examples, and it's kind of an anomaly to me that the teaching and the examples are all there, but the dreadful exploitation of animals is continuing. So I'd like to challenge people of faith and faith leaders to study at least the teaching of their own faith regarding our relationship with animals, and then take steps to put it into practice. And it's just wonderful to have faith colleagues on this webinar today who are doing exactly that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce. You took us down into the depths with a reminder of the cruelty of factory farming and our willing blindness to that, but you've brought us back up with quotations that give us hope. Thank you very much indeed. That was very inspiring. I'm going to move on now to, very timely, to Rabbi Yonatan Neril, who is going to talk about how faith communities can promote shifts to sustainable food systems. So how can we mobilize faith communities and religious figures for ecological action, which is the call to action that we just heard from Joyce. Thank you, Yonatan. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'd like to present briefly about how faith communities can promote shifts to sustainable food systems. And I'm going to share in the chat something about Bible eco infographics, including a link. We can go to the next slide. So part of what we did at the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development is we developed a visual way of looking at the connection between animal welfare and ecology based on teachings from the Hebrew Bible. So here are 7 verses that relate to people's relations to animals. And I'll just highlight the 5th one from the left, Genesis chapter 24, verse 14. Rebecca said, "Drink, and I will also water your camels." That one of the ways, the key test that Abraham's assistant Eliezer had when he was choosing a wife for his son Isaac, was whether the woman who Isaac met at the well would not only give water to the men that came with Eliezer, but also provide water to the 10 camels that traveled from the land of Canaan to what's today southeastern Turkey. And Rebecca passed that test. A camel amazingly can drink 135 liters of water after going on in the desert for 6 to 8 days. And so miraculously, she might have watered 1,350 liters. And that shows her devotion and how much she cared not only about the people, but also about the animals. And so here, these are other slides. I'm not going to go into each one. You can go to the next slide. And so this is at the top is from the book of Psalms. God is good to all, and God's mercy is upon all his works. And here's a visual presentation of what a small scale animal system looks like. Human animal relation, domesticated cows and chickens in some villages today and in the Western world in pre-modern times. And then at the bottom is the amount of meat that people might have eaten in those times, maybe once a month eating meat, because if you kill the cow, then you lose the milk. And then if you kill the chicken, you lose the eggs. So next slide, please. So here we can see a presentation of the system that we have today. And at the bottom, the amount of meat that people are eating, sometimes at every meal, eating animal products. Next slide. So this is presenting from the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 29. God said to the first human being, "See, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit, they shall be yours for food." And so we see at the end of the first chapter of Genesis that God's vision for people was to eat plants. And that was also the case in the next verse, which is not the next slide, but verse 30 says that that animals should also eat plants. And so God's vision was that the lion would lie down with the lamb. Life would not take life to sustain life, but rather the bounty of food, the plant-based food is what people and animals would both be eating. And verse 31, the last verse of chapter 1 says, and it was so, and God saw it was very good. What was very good was that God created a system of harmony, of where we didn't have to kill each other in order to survive. And Chief Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook wrote about 100 years ago that this system was one that would come in future times, and many people, including Rabbi David Rosen, think that that's come today. So next slide. So we can see here that there are 7 food groups when you eliminate animals: beans, oil, grain, nuts, seeds, fruits, and vegetables, and there's plenty to eat. Next slide. So here's a couple of websites and where you can find more. I put in the Zoom chat about the top one, the Bible Eco Infographics, including some of what I just showed you. There's actually 5 more of such infographics. And then my organization has a second resource called Eco Preacher on food and faith, which is encouraging Christian pastors and priests to preach and teach about ecology, as well as food ethics, and based on the Revised Common Lectionary, which many Christian churches use for preaching each week. And this is a way of trying to encourage clergy from the Christian tradition, as well as we have resources from other faith traditions that relate to how do we bring religion to bear for a more sustainable and spiritually aware planet, starting with our food choices. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yonatan, for that inspiring link between practical action and some of the earliest teachings that we have. That was fascinating. I'm going to move now to another great religion of the world, Islam. Our speaker, Marium Husain, is the lead author of Islam and Food Systems for the United Nations Environment Programme. And she will be talking about an Islamic perspective on our food system and how we can promote ethical production and consumption. Thank you, Marium.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And thank you to all the organizers of this webinar, and as well as my fellow speakers as well too. It's been absolutely really enriching to hear from everybody's perspective. I would also like to say a special thanks to Iyad Abu-Mogli at UNEP for referring me to this webinar as well, and for also his work on the Islam and Food Systems report. So before I get started, I think one thing that's been coming to mind, and I wonder if it's been coming to you as well, is with everything that's going on in the world, it just feels like a lot of chaos, a lot of complexity, and it feels very overwhelming at times, no matter what faith you belong to and how much faith you may have. And I'm not sure if anyone's read this book or not, but I had recently read a book called Chaos Theory by James Glick. And it was very fascinating that despite it being very obviously science heavy, he talks about how essentially in all of these chaotic patterns, you essentially find very simple principles or simple laws that make sense of all that disorganization. And it was really comforting because if your story is like mine, where growing up in a certain religious practice and you do things because you have been told them, right? And it just seems like that makes a lot of sense. And the way that Islam spoke to me, which is why I continue to practice it, was that the way you practice your faith is not even just so much are you following laws, but what the Quran was also asking us to do, I realize, is also to understand. And so and helping to understand these very complex principles by using simple mechanisms, simple laws, simple understandings that faith traditions give us, which is really very comforting to me. And throughout the Quran, it talks about those who believe or those who understand. And so with this understanding, I think this webinar has done a great job of highlighting that how faith traditions can help combine that science and faith aspect to the world around us, and specifically as it comes to farming practices or food systems. And for those who are familiar, the food systems that we have today are extremely complex, very chaotic, and like we've been saying, are also very destructive, sadly. And whereas things may have worked at some point in time and for a certain purpose, as we look to the future, it's a little bleak if these food systems can sustain us the way they are currently. And that's where it's really comforting to know that we're not alone in this, or that there is no precedent for this, but all we have to do is to look to certain faith traditions as well as indigenous traditions to get some of those simple solutions back. So part of my story, which maybe some of you can relate to as well, is that I am a physician by career, and a lot of the way I used to understand things was just the way the world was around me and what I was taught again. And in that, medicine helped. And that's what you kind of did, right? You diagnosed and you gave people medicine. But then what I realized was that there isn't a cure for everything that we see with the current medications, but that people were sick because of what they ate, not so much of what I could or couldn't do for them. And thankfully, through all of that work, I was led to the Faith and Food Coalition, which Azmaira alluded to earlier. And I really encourage everybody to go and check them out as well, too. We spoke at the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021, where we talked about not so much what are the solutions or what exactly people should do, but maybe what are different value systems we can bring to those solutions or to how we approach our current problems using faith tradition. And then that also led to the UNEP report, Islam and Food Systems. So really quick, I want to make sure I highlight the authors: Dr. Husna Ahmed, Dr. Hisham Muharram, Dr. Madiha Saeed, Dr. Rima Tayyam, Dr. Najat Muhammad, and then again, Dr. Iyad Abu-Mogli and myself. So I will put the links in the chat as well, but the three main topics we focused on were production, food preparation and transport, and then consumption. As it relates to production, I wanted to highlight the work that Dr. Najad and Dr. Husna did about Islamic farming. So again, not so much about what's the legality of it from an Islamic perspective, but using historical precedent for how we can reimagine what we currently understand about farming. And the two main principles that came from that, which again, the speakers have alluded to also, is respecting the soil, right? And how agricultural practices that the Prophet, peace be upon him, practiced, as well as those who came after him, that how you respected the soil and promoted regeneration versus exhaustion of it and a complete extraction of it. And there was also a focus on biodiversity, where, as Dr. Vandana mentioned also, that it wasn't just monocrops and it wasn't violent. It was focusing on all of the foods and how do you promote that food production based on even what the Quran talks about when it talks about all of these different crops. And so why would you ever promote something that or not let people have a crop that even the Quran is promoting? So, and with all of that, it also focused, again, understanding complex systems, is that by focusing on those simple principles, you were able to protect the rights of animals. So everybody's familiar with halal, for example. Landowners had rights, so you were able to promote that, respecting people's culture, promoting communal unity. So all of those things became downstream benefits from simple practices that were put in place. And then the last thing I want to touch on is about consumption. And so we all understand halal, but the other partner to that is tayyib, so clean and pure foods. And the Quran always promotes, along with halal, this tayyib concept, which can come from these very intelligent underlying agricultural practices. So to end with this, I just want to highlight that I think in terms of all the complexities we're seeing in the world, as bleak as it may seem, there are answers out there. There are simple practices that we can implement. And at least when it comes from an Islamic perspective, the promotion of halal and tayyib foods, and then promoting these farming practices that are consistent with Quranic and Sunnah principles. Thank you so much again for the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Marium. That was absolutely fascinating. I think one of the aspects of this webinar so far that I've particularly enjoyed is hearing from people who are looking deeply into one particular faith or another, and uncovering for us the teachings that are a core part of that faith in terms of its practice and its preaching. And that's very inspiring, because the other words that really struck me were chaotic, complex, and destructive about the global food system. And it's very comforting to think that we are not alone, and that we actually do have teachings that can point us in the right direction. So thank you very much. Okay, well, we are reaching the end of our discussion, and we have one more speaker to go, a colleague of mine, Martin Palmer. He is the founding president of FaithInvest. And Martin, we've heard an awful lot. We've been really taken into some, I was going to say deep dives. I mean, maybe you can't dive very deep if you've only got 7 minutes to say something, but we've been given a glimpse of what a particular faith teach, and how we can learn from those ancient teachings and principles and values. But beyond that, what else can the faith do? What should they be doing in terms of bringing about systemic change? So over to you.
Thank you, Susie, and thank you also to Compassionate World Farming. It's a joy always to work with them. In 1986, the first meeting of the major religions with the major environmental organizations took place in Assisi, and 5 statements on the environment were issued. At that point, there were 3 religiously inspired environmental programs in the world. There's now over 1 million. There have been statements from every major faith, every major tradition within every major faith, about the environment, about sustainability, about climate, and so on and so forth. There have been, as I now say, about 1 million projects around the world, programs working with churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, in almost every community, and at a small level, making an enormous change. In 2015, the UN declared that the faith environment movement was the largest civil society movement in the world. So we're there, although, as has been mentioned before, often not noticed, certainly often not invited to things, but we've just kind of got on with it. So there are a lot of statements, a lot of plans. But the one thing that we've kind of forgotten is that if we are 80% of the world, as we've heard from various people, including Joyce, then we are probably the problem. Because if we are 80% of the world is not making the shifts that we need to make. But also as 80%, we are also major stakeholders. The major faiths run about 50% of all schools, 65% of all schools in sub-Saharan Africa, according to UNICEF. They run a third of all universities. They run more than a third of all medical facilities. And they are also one of the largest landowners. Probably somewhere in the region of 9 to 10% of the habitable surface of the planet is owned outright or managed by faiths. So take, for example, in Cambodia, over 350 community forests are actually managed by Buddhist communities. But we are also one of the largest investing groups in the world. It's almost impossible to calculate how much the faiths have, because the old division between God and Mammon is well reserved and well protected in the financial reports of faith groups. They're very hard to find out how much money there is, but the guesstimates are that somewhere in the region of $4 to $5 trillion worth of investment is held by the major faiths. That does not count all the churches, all the mosques, all the schools, all the charitable groups. And we also produce, and we did this calculation with the Eid Foundation a few years ago, that we produce or we serve about 500 million meals a day. We heard about the langar, the Sikh tradition of providing a free kitchen, but we are feeding people through homes, through schools, through universities, through welfare, through rites and passages and festivals. So we are an enormous purchaser. We are also an enormous producer. Probably at least a third of the land that the faiths own around the world is agricultural. In Ethiopia, 35,000 priests, most of them are Christian priests, most of them are farmers. So we are part of the problem, and therefore we are also part of the solution. And an awful lot of the work of the faiths over the last 40 years has been telling other people what they ought to do, governments, the UN, the business world. Well, we've got to start putting our own house in order. And one of the biggest areas that we can do this is in investments. And FaithInvest, the group that I'm the president of and Susie is part of, came into being in 2019 at the request of Prince Philip, who said, look, the faiths keep telling us what we ought to do, but why aren't they doing it themselves? If they moved their investments into sustainable investment, they could change the market almost overnight. And so we have a program called Faith Consistent Investing. We've heard these wonderful teachings. Joyce has produced a marvelous book in which you can find all these. But how do we use them? Well, we use them by saying to the faiths, to each one, the ones that we belong to, are you faith consistent in your investment? You say this, you have this in your holy books. So what? How is that shaping where you put your money, how you invest, how you use your land, how you use your buildings? So we have to be practical now. We know what needs to be done, and we know where the tools are within our own faiths where we can change that. That's through the education systems we run. That's through the welfare that we do, and that's through the investments we have. Now, we've been on this planet as human beings, as Homo sapiens, for tens of thousands of years. And in that time, we've gained a certain wisdom, which we've heard distilled in the presentations today from the different faiths. We've gained a certain wisdom about how to live as part of life on this planet. But we didn't call it conservation, and we didn't call it environment, and we didn't call it sustainability. We called it sacred. So part of what we have to recover as faiths is a sense that we walk on holy ground. We are in a sacred place. And that ought to inspire how we use everything, how we relate to everything. We're not stewards of this planet, we're part of it. And there's a wonderful story that kind of puts us in perspective from the Taoist text called the Liezi, probably written around about the 3rd century AD. And in it, a young boy is at a feast which is given by a wealthy man, very, very wealthy man, who is about to set off on a trip. And he is praising how marvelous it is that all this food they've eaten, all the meat and the fish and the birds, how that's all kept fresh by nature until we want to eat it. And isn't that kind of nature to look after us like that? And the boy stands up and he goes, "Oh, no, that's rubbish." The whole family there is shocked and appalled. What he's saying? He says, "Look, on that basis, human beings are here so that mosquitoes can eat our blood and tigers can chew our bones. So please don't pretend that everything is here for us, when it might well be the other way around. That's perhaps what we need to fuse in order to have a true sense of sacred and a true sense of being faith consistent in everything, what we eat, how we behave, and where we invest." Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for reminding us that those of us who belong to faith are part of the problem, are the problem probably, but also can be part of the solution. That was, and also for reminding us that the faiths are huge stakeholders in the planet, and people don't often think of them as stakeholders, but they are. They own things, they run things, they manage things, they buy things, and they provide things, as well as inspiration and teachings and influence. So we're coming to the next Q&A, opportunity for Q&A. So I invite you to go to slido.com and put in your questions or put them into the chat. And I'm going to be joined by our speakers, and everyone will have a chance to answer the questions. I think while people are putting in their questions, one question I'd like to put to you is: are things getting better or worse for food systems? Joyce, you gave us some pretty horrendous statistics. I don't know if you would like to have a go at that.
Well, I think it's kind of things are getting better and things are getting worse. Because in parts of the world where meat eating has not been widely possible, such as in perhaps China, where people often went hungry 50 years ago and there was a great famine. So when people find that they move into the middle class or the cities, the first thing they want to add to their diet is meat. And at the moment, the Chinese government is helping to support that need, that request. And there are an awful lot of pig factory farms in China, multi-story pig factory farms being built and so on. But really, China is at the place where perhaps the USA was in 1950, and perhaps the UK and a lot of Europe as well. People came out of a bad time and they wanted to eat more meat. So while in the UK and in parts of Europe, there's quite a move towards plant-based diets and going vegan and so on, that is not the case universally. And also, you have to say that in some parts of the world, maybe sub-Saharan Africa, people can't afford meat very often. So are we in a position to say, well, we can have meat 7 days a week and twice or 3 times a day, like my dad? But you can't have it. So there are all sorts of different questions involved here. I think it's really difficult. So I think what we have to say is generally the world as a whole has to kind of put a limit on how much meat is okay for any one person to eat in a week or in a year or whatever. And that means that everybody can have that much, but nobody has more. But you help people who have much less to have that much. But also that meat must come from animals that are respected, recognized as sentient, are kept in regenerative, high welfare conditions, and not transported halfway around the world, which often happens at the moment, just to satisfy people's desires. So I think there's got to be a move towards more plant-based diets. There's got to be a move towards regenerative, high welfare farming. And then perhaps we can come to some kind of equilibrium. I mean, I do think probably and I'm quoting Philip, my boss here. In 100 years, probably we won't be eating meat. We'll be eating possibly cultivated meat if we're still hooked on that taste and texture. And we'll be eating a lot more plants. And hopefully, the world will be the sort of natural world will be able to flourish. And plants will be more biodiverse. Birds and wild animals will have space in which to live and enjoy their lives. So I think we can look forward to a sort of, we could create a kind of paradise on Earth, but we do need to change our ways if we want to get there.
Well, 100 years is a long way to go, long time to wait. And I think there are lots of people, particularly from a climate perspective, who say we don't have time to wait. So there's another question that's come in, which is population growth a factor in this our current food system? So we've got the pressure of growing numbers of people, and that's leading to pressure for industrialized farming. Rabbi Yonatan, Neril, perhaps I could throw that question to you. I mean, how much of a factor is population growth? And if that is the case, what can we do about it?
Well, I would say population growth is certainly a factor. And in the book that I published, Eco Bible, I talk about that in several of the commentaries. And I've had conversations with religious leaders from many faith traditions who, even though they may not say this publicly, but they do admit that it doesn't make sense to expand population in situations where there's an inability to feed the existing population. So, and I think it's something to put on the table, that we can't simultaneously expand human population and expand consumer society and at the same time curb climate change and have an equitable and sustainable food system. So I think we need to prioritize. And I think the time has come for religious figures and clergy to have open conversations about what God wants for us at this critical moment in history.
Martin, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, the weight of population growth and what that's doing to our food choices or the pressure.
I mean, the basic issue is how much does somebody in Europe or America consume compared with somebody in Zambia or in Colombia? So population, yes, it is an issue. But the major problem at the moment is how much we in the developed or the overdeveloped world, whichever language you want to use, consume. And Marium, you probably know that wonderful Shiite phrase, which is that the prophet said you can have as many wives as you want, but only as many children as the earth can support. It's a pretty good wisdom. I'm not so sure about the many wives. I hasten to add that. But the principle that you only have as many children as you can support, if we would apply that, interesting one.
Well, I mean, that brings us on to another question, which is, how do we respond to the position that it's only the privileged who can afford to choose how to eat, and that therefore promoting a plant-based diet is elitist? You've just been talking about the difference, Martin, between what someone in Europe or UK or America eats compared to someone in Zambia or Pakistan or rural China. Is it elitist? Is this a problem of privilege at its heart? It's probably the globalized world that is driving the globalized food system.
I think this is where the faiths as purchasers are so important, because the prices or the cost of buying good food depends on demand. And we've seen that already in the UK, very interesting example, and much of this down to the work of compassion in world farming has been the fact that now almost all eggs that you can buy in any major supermarket will be free range or even organic and free range, because the demand was created. Now, as you said, Susie, our great friends in the African American church had no idea that the food they were buying was bad,
had no idea that there were other alternatives. We did the same thing, if you remember, with the Methodists and their international centre in London and the Quakers. We said, well, why don't you actually become part of the demand that will lower the cost of buying stuff, because it becomes more viable to produce on scale, but still with the same values in terms of organic, free range, local, etc. So I think part of the answer lies in our hands. If we think it's elitist, let's make it actually common. Now we could do that by every day. If we're serving 500 million meals a day, if we said, and those have to be faith consistent with our values, we would make those kind of products much more affordable, because the demand would mean the cost would drop. It's quite a simple equation at one level.
Marium, I wonder what you think about this question of, is this really an issue of the privileged world versus the rest of the world? And therefore, what is our responsibility? Because actually, in some ways, I mean, what Joyce was saying earlier about the pressure for increased meat in China is as a result of people getting wealthier and wanting to adopt our diet. I mean, a lot of indigenous peoples around the world actually have a mainly plant-based diet. As Rabbi Yonatan said, if you kill the cow, you've lost the milk. If you kill the chicken, you've lost the egg. So for them, eating meat is actually a very precious thing to do.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. I think I agree that I think based on what Martin is saying as well too, I think it kind of comes back to just even what is the understanding beyond those behaviors, kind of like what I was referring to before, is that, well, why are people imprinting off of a Western culture, right, or a Western paradigm? And if there's been this promotion that sort of Western value model is the better model, then it makes sense that people would want to do that, let's say, per se, especially when you are looking at things from not only just a cultural lens, but a poverty lens, where maybe the only access you have is the cheap food, or is the readily available food that might be there. And so you may have a greater understanding that food is healthier, and that I'm not eating healthier food, but I am limited by my poverty and by the economics of the situation. And so I think it's one of those things where we almost have to take a step back, is the way I think about it, that we can get bogged down with what's elitist, what's not, but what is the bigger issue? And that is potentially, if I may say, that maybe a Western model of diet is not maybe the right one, or maybe not the most well-informed one. And maybe it was at one point, and again, maybe at those times, those systems served a certain purpose, but now they don't, it seems like, right, based on the future. And so now switching back to just our understanding of what is healthy. And that relates to the question too about even with halal itself, and that's been coming up in the chats too, that again, a lot of it is just how are these issues being framed, I think. And I think all religions have been, unfortunately, victims of framing and what certain individual people may do, and then how that becomes the entire narrative. And so if you look across indigenous cultures, and again, faith broadly, and more historically, I should say, that even within Islam, people only ate meat maybe once a week, or even sometimes once a month, because of drought, because of other issues, having to move. So meat wasn't even a very common thing, even within different religious traditions. So again, it's a lot of just, I think, the consequence of the times that we're in and what narratives are being put out there. And I would just say that we can follow the science while also incorporating not only our faiths, but also the historical precedents that are there too, that what we're doing right now is not working. So it shouldn't be a precedent for people following those practices. I hope that it helps answer the question.
Yes, definitely. And I think your comment about, maybe it worked for us once before, but the Western diet doesn't work for us now. We're reaping the consequences of that, aren't we? In terms of people's individual health and the misery that is caused by everything from diabetes to heart conditions and so on. One final question I want to send your way, Joyce, which is, what do we have to do for people to become revolted by our current industrialized food system?
Well, I mean, sadly, I think they have to know. I mean, I have people I meet, or friends or acquaintances, and I can bet that probably 70% of them know almost nothing about industrial farming and exploitation of animals. And probably 20% of them know a little bit and think it's bad and buy free-range eggs. Maybe 10% really know. So it's just so important that we all amplify our messages through the media as much as we can, through writing, through social media, etc., and really make it a topic that becomes discussed in every home, because at the moment it's just ignored. You know, everyone in the sort of Christian Western world sat down to eat millions of turkeys a few weeks ago. Most of those turkeys having led totally miserable lives in factory farms. So we're celebrating the birth of the so-called savior by killing lots of animals who live miserable lives. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I don't think you can't go out and preach in a sort of horrible way and put people off, but you've got to drop hints and ask questions and make it a real topic. And as I say, if you're with an organization, use the channels you have to really spread the message. And I mean, we all try to do that, but perhaps we have to try even harder.
Yes, I think there's a massive disconnect, isn't there, between talking from a Western perspective, the food we eat and how it's produced. I live in a rural area, and I'm always astonished how you never see chickens, because they're housed in giant sheds. It's one of the most widely eaten meats, and you never see chickens. And most people don't think about it. You know, things come nicely packaged in little, cellophane wrapped packs in the supermarket, and they're not connected to their food and the food production in the way that, for example, Vandana was talking about when it came to peasant farmers. They're just not connected, and we don't do it. How many of us grow our own food? So it's a bit of a mountain to climb, isn't it? Especially when you factor in the cost of living crisis, which means people are really struggling with increased prices.
Oh, could I add one thing about the cost of living? Because I do think it's kind of scandalous at government level that people are kept on such low incomes that they are forced to buy the cheapest, most horrible factory farmed meat, eggs, whatever, or they have to go to food banks and buy whatever's there. You know, for example, the UK, the 10th largest industrial nation or the 3rd or something, but a rich country, that we allow people to be so poor that they couldn't, at this moment in time, choose to buy an organically reared chicken or free-range eggs. You know, so I mean, I think that's another question, but I think it's really important that governments take it on board. So lots of political lobbying, please.
Could I just say the food banks is quite an issue, and we raised it with our local food banks here that they were asking for crap food, basically. And so the group made a decision that it would now actually buy or ask for organic vegetables, free-range meat, etc. It was a conscious choice to say just because you're poor doesn't mean you have to have crap to eat. And the debate that had to go on as to whether it was right to spend more on better than get more for less, really, as you say, Joyce, just revealed so many prejudices, so many anxieties. But in the end, they voted, no, we will have a policy of only buying sustainable food.
Brilliant.
That's an inspiring note for us to end this particular session on. Thank you very much to all four of you for some very interesting and energizing and inspiring presentations. We're going to move now to our final words from all the speakers. You'll all have a couple of minutes for final words, reflections, or for questions to other speakers. And I'm going to invite, as they are slowly coming on board, all the speakers to join us. Missing Vandana Shiva, unfortunately, as I mentioned, but delighted to have everyone else here. So let's start by one question that's come in. How might faith leaders partner with non-religious but like-minded stakeholders to advance food systems transformation? And how about Azmaira, we go to you for that one, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Susie. I'm so sorry that I wasn't able to join you earlier. I had our electricity cut out and I had trouble getting back. Yeah, how can we work? This is such an important question. We talk about partnerships. We talk about broadening our the organizations that we work with, but how do we do it? At the Faith for Earth Coalition, we've convened, and I believe he was on the call earlier, the Faith for Earth Steering Committee that's chaired by Mr. Dr. Carlos Zapada of the Laudato Si Research Institute. We're thinking with him on how we can engage the 82 accredited faith-based organizations to the United Nations Environment Assembly with the other 9 formally recognized major groups. Building synergies, identifying where the commonalities are in the key message within each of the major group is very important in building that synergy, building that partnership, because we realized we're really not saying anything different. Perhaps the language that we use is a little bit more inspired, or has the potential to inspire others. As opposed to perhaps the way that the scientists talk about more or less the same issues. So how do we work together? What are these common points? And how can we have a candid conversation on how we can leverage each other's human resources, potentials, knowledge to work towards this common goal together? So we're seeing a lot of this come up. So it's not only with the steering committee, as I mentioned, it's with the interfaith thematic working groups. Of course, the Faith for Earth Coalition has been very lucky to be a facilitator, to be a convener in this space. And challenges arise, but we work transparently and we work honestly in trying to overcome that, and really just explain that we're working towards one goal. And the best way to do that is to leverage on each other's respective capabilities.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Azmaira. I'm going to go to Yonatan next. Just offering you a couple of minutes for final thoughts and reflections. I know that you have to leave at 4. So I wonder, from everything you've heard in this debate and this discussion today, what is it that you're really struck by, or the message that you want to leave for us?
Well, I'd like to share a story that the Nobel laureate Toni Morrison told of a young boy who comes to an elder woman with a bird in his hands. And he says to the woman, "Can you tell me whether the bird in my hands is alive or dead?" And she looks at the boy and she realizes that he's playing a trick on her. Because if she says that the bird is dead, then he will open his hands and the bird will fly away and she will be wrong. And if she says the bird is alive, he will close his hands and crush the bird, and she will also be wrong. He's got her coming and going. So she thinks to herself for a moment, and she looks at the boy and says to him, "I don't know whether the bird in your hands is alive or dead. All I know is that the life of the bird is in your hands." And I believe this is a metaphor for our situation today, that we have 24 billion chickens in factory farms and tens of billions of other animals, including sea life in industrial and factory raising of animals. What does this say about our spiritual awareness as a species? And more importantly, how can we raise our level of spiritual awareness so that we liberate the animals from the oppression and suffering that we're causing them, and so that we enable the next generation to inherit a thriving, sustainable, and spiritually aware planet? That's my hope and my blessing for us. And I just encourage us to continue to engage in this important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. What a wonderful story, and a lovely sort of ending as well. I'm going to go to David Clough next for your final thoughts or reflections.
Thanks, Susie. It's been really interesting listening to the contributions and seeing the questions and the responses to questions. One of the things I'm struck by is the variety of vocations that are on display in this conversation. It strikes me that we've seen contributions that are sort of high-level integrative engagements with international public policy, and also engagements which are trying to be sort of very specific and local and sort of well engaged with sort of particular faith communities. And then, you know, other contributions, you know, that don't easily fit into either of those categories. And it strikes me that as those of us sort of working in this space, we probably need to be more attentive to the different kinds of roles that are necessary for good work in this faith space. So as a Christian theologian, I'm particularly motivated by trying to bring a sort of Christian constituency to motivate them to be motivated to participate in these conversations. And I think there's still a lot of work to do there. But of course, we also need all of these other projects that are, you know, maybe much more immediately important in relation to shaping UN policy and, you know, representing faith organizations, you know, in those big contexts. And so I think I come away from this conversation with a sort of greater sense of the diversity of different kinds of tasks and organizing tasks and campaigning tasks that are going to be necessary in order for us to make the progress that we want to see.
Thank you. Thank you. Thomas, I'm going to come to you next. What are your final thoughts or observations?
Thank you very much. I think that was a really special event. I think what's clear is there's huge potential, you know, through the engagement with faith-based organizations, and in their own constituencies, but also if they are able to come together and build a coalition on that. I think, you know, it's clear that at the end, these are universal values, no? And, you know, for them to be accepted by all, it's important to highlight, you know, that we, you know, most of the faith tradition share the same values, and that should be the basis for food system transformation. And just to be realistic, that we're talking about food system transformation, but it's not separated from other, you know, development issues, which, you know, the industrial agriculture is embedded in a development paradigm, emphasizing, you know, economic growth, and we really need to move away from that if we are able to prosper on Earth. So, and we believe that's an ethical transformation, but also an inner and cultural and spiritual transformation. So within the Conscious Food Systems Alliance, we are really wanting to build on all this work to turn that into an agenda that can be secular also, and grounded in science and many existing efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Joyce, what are your final thoughts?
Gosh, so many thoughts from and so much inspiration from great speakers today. I was just thinking another faith, if you like, that I covered in my book was First Nations peoples in Australia. And they have a word which, well, we call it country, but it doesn't mean like the countryside and the pretty view from your window. It means everything that is around you, the tree, the stones, the rocks, the hills, the crops, the animals, it's everything. And you are just part of that. And you know, there was a lovely quote from a First Nations person who said, if part of country is wounded, I am hurt. We are all hurt. And perhaps we need to get some of that kind of, do I call it spiritual? I'm not sure, but a different way of approaching the earth. So it's not just resources or livestock, rubbish. These are sentient beings, farmed animals, resources. Well, I don't know. The trees that are growing and crops that are growing, are they resources? I think we need to look at our terminology as well. I think we need to feel much more involved at the personal level with nature And we have to just work really hard together as much as possible to transform the food systems so that they are, decent and respectful of all life on Earth, and so that the suffering of hungry humans and factory farmed animals and other animals that are exploited for our benefit, so that all these things are changed. And we all can do our bit personally, but we have to work together if we're going to have the big change. So work together, work together, work together.
Thank you. That's certainly a call to action, Joyce. Work together. Marium, what are your final thoughts or comments?
Yeah, no, thank you so much again. This has been a privilege being with all the speakers here today. I really am grateful. I think one thing that we always bring up at some of these talks, especially in Muslim circles, is a quote from the Prophet, peace be upon him, that he had said that if essentially if the apocalypse was coming to you right now, or if you saw it in the horizon and you are planting a small little sapling or seed, still plant it. Even though things may not work out in the end, still plant it. And I think on a literal level, I used to think that, it was just about planting a seed. It's about environment, sustainability. But I think on higher levels now, there's so much hope in there. There's so much faith in there. And there's so much wisdom in that you never know what could happen, even if things don't look the greatest. But I think that combination of that science and faith is really going to get us out of this. And I think it's just a choice if we want to do it. We have the tools, we have the resources. I think we just need to do it and keep planting that seed.
Great. It's a choice and we have the tools. Fantastic. Martin, you are our last speaker and you have the final thought to share with us. Over to you.
And I have two. I think the first thought I have is, and this comes very much from our FaithInvest world, which is institutionally, the faiths actually have the means to begin the transformation. What we need from our allies, like compassionate world farming, is where should we invest? What are the products that we should be enabling because we put our money into it in order to increase the facilities and capacity without sacrificing the kindness, the compassion that you so strongly push and encourage? We also need to know what is the best way to farm. We've already heard about Husna Ahmed, who set up Islamic farming. We were joyful to support her when in ARC, Susie and I working in the Alliance of Religions Conservation with that. There's also Farming God's Way, which is hugely popular in terms of deciding how to farm. We need good knowledge, we need good information so that as institutions, and our institutions are available to be pushed, they move. So help us to know where to invest, help us to know how to farm and how to actually be compassionate at every level. The final one is personal. There's a wonderful Russian Orthodox story which says when you finish packing and you're about to go on your journey, sit down and wait for your soul to catch up with your body. What if we were to actually encourage the creation in different faiths of graces? Not just when we've bought the food, cooked it, and are about to eat it, which is kind of slightly too late. What about a grace before we go shopping? What about actually asking each faith to produce a grace before you go shopping? That we are mindful before we even go shopping, and then have a grace, saying thank you for the food afterwards. It's a tradition in every single one of our faiths. Maybe it's time to revive it.
Thank you, Martin. Actually, I am going to go to Azmaira again for a last comment, because I actually asked you a question which was one of the ones that we had come in. But I just wondered, I know you had some connectivity problems that kept you out of the webinar for some of it, but is there a final thought you want to share with us?
Well, the conversations like this are so important. But as we discussed in our preparatory call, the 30 minutes before we went live, Martin, in fact, asked this question. He said, where do we go from here? Yeah, how do we actually implement or have people in their households and their families talk about or recite the grace before they go shopping? what does it take to push the needle so that we're transforming individuals, transforming communities, societies, institutions, and allow me to simplify it and just bring it down to the thing that drives, I believe, each one of us here, and it's a deep connection with the earth, with the living things that are around us. I adore the quote or the term from the First Nation people that Joyce shared with us earlier. I think it's really important for us to recognize that, you know, although we can be selfish, that we're part of an interconnected system. You know, we talk about it a lot at UNEP, at the global level, at this huge institutional scale, but you know, let's bring it back down to the motivation, our ikigai, why we do what we do, and let's live it.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring, and also a very important thought. What are the next steps? We're going to ask that question of you, the audience, now, and we'll have a Slido screen that will be shown just now. And please keep your answers tight if you can. We've got a couple of key questions arising as a result of this webinar. The first one is, what actions might you take because of this webinar? And the second one will be, what has most inspired you today? So if you could just take a few minutes to fill those in. Go veggie is one of them, yeah. And vegan. Speak with faith representatives, yes. Bring this into the infrastructures of our faith groups. Great. Shared a recording of this webinar with our local Quaker group. Just to remind everyone, you will be sent a link to this webinar. Oh gosh, they're all flooding in now. Talk to friends and families. Spread the word. Write and share a prayer before shopping. Learn about food waste. Oh, I plan to get involved with the Conscious Food Systems Alliance and bring broader awareness to the US. Fantastic. Speak with a wide variety of people, start a conversation at my local church. This is wonderful. Fantastic. Start difficult conversations around food. One of the questions we didn't have time to get to was, how do you begin a difficult conversation with other people about their food choices? Educate children, yes. Write an article for my church newsletter. Fantastic. Lots of inspiring actions. So, I mean, these questions will stay up so you can carry on adding to them, but I wonder if we should go to the next one now. What has inspired you most about today? Breadth of speakers, yes, I would agree with that. It was wonderful to have so many different faith perspectives shared. Yeah, unity of purpose, the honest conversation. Saying grace before going shopping. Martin, you might have started something. Something can be done by the most unexpected people. Yes, that's true. Yeah. The congruence between faith and food, and the scale at which the different faiths could actually make a difference. Very true. We have more in common to unite us than differences to divide us. Brilliant. Faith groups can have a major influence if they put their minds to it. Very true. And I think also hearing all the different faith texts and the different resources available has been wonderful as well. A recording of the webinar will be available, will be sent to everyone afterwards. So I think this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you all for all your contributions. You will be sent a sort of survey, and please, we do encourage you to, probably there's a link in the chat. We do encourage you to fill it in, please. Yes, it's already in the chat. If you just click on the link and just, it'll probably only take about 2 or 3 minutes to complete. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers for your time, for your contributions, for your wisdom, for your insights. I think it's been fantastic, an immensely rich discussion, lots of food for thought, and lots of next steps that we have to begin thinking about. Thank you everyone else who joined us for this webinar. As I mentioned, it has been recorded. You will be sent a copy of the webinar afterwards. And with that, I would like to introduce Philip Lymbery, Global CEO for Compassion and Well Farming, to give his closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Susie. Thank you so much for your chairing, and to all of our speakers for a hugely inspiring conversation. I've noticed in the Slido, the last question, one of the responses was diverse speakers, one goal, and I have to say that it cannot be put any better than that. Diverse speakers, one goal: to change food systems for the benefit of animals, people, and the planet. So a rich conversation enabled by wonderful speakers from a diversity of faiths. Very well chaired, Susie. A big thanks to our organising team behind the scenes, led by Carol McKenna and Paul Taylor. And thanks to all of you who have joined this webinar. I'm so pleased that we've started this important conversation, a conversation to inspire faith leaders and people of faith everywhere to get involved in transforming food and farming systems, in creating better human, animal, and planetary health. If you're interested in going deeper into the role of the faith and the well-being of animals, again, I can only recommend the book by my colleague Joyce De Silva, who you heard from today, Animal Welfare in World Religion, Teaching and Practice. I'd like to just mention that Compassion will be hosting further webinars in the future, so do keep an eye out on those. But we've heard some fantastic top lines today. We've heard how faiths are responsible for $5 trillion of investment, serving 500 million meals a day and providing guidance to the lives of 4/5 of the world's population. Faith involvement can therefore be a game changer for food, for animals, for the future of people everywhere, moving us away from a future that otherwise looks bleak with that triple planetary crisis that we heard about. It can help us move away from a food system that fails to address the inequality and hunger that prevails in so many parts of the world, and fails to preserve that which we need if we're going to produce food in the future: our soil. We can reconnect. We heard today, with mindfulness about our food. If we do all of this, if we get involved, big change is possible. A big part of that change means reminding ourselves that other beings are intended first for themselves, not merely for human use. We can recognize the links between animals, their consumption, and our faith. We can enhance the world by embracing the beautiful, life-affirming, compassionate solutions that are out there in helping us go to more nature-friendly farming, in helping us to go to more balanced diets, more animal-friendly diets. In this way, we can save the future. The future really is down to us. The future involves mobilizing our faith. There's so much to do. Please Continue to be involved, get further involved in the movement to move beyond industrial animal agriculture toward food system transformation. Sign up to Compassion in World Farming's End It campaign. You can find it on the internet, endit, END.IT. We're building a global movement of citizens, organizations, and forward-thinking businesses, of farmers, philosophers, and faiths, calling on world leaders to urgently transform our food system and end factory farming for all our sakes. Please join us. And a final thank you to you for joining us, to our partners, to our speakers, to everyone involved in shaping the future for the better. Thank you so much.